This is ridiculous. She is a suspended custodian, a vandal.
Do you know how to resolve the differentiability crisis on slide 9?
The differentiability does not fail.
She is using a nonlinear flow. She is letting the boundary contract under its own curvature.
The manifold is stable.
The hallway of Fulton University's mathematics department smelled of floor wax and lemon-scented bleach. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the building was dead quiet. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic swish of Elena Brooks's mop sliding across the green linoleum. Elena was 24, but her shoulders often carried the weight of someone twice her age. She wore oversized gray work scrubs with her name embroidered in faded blue thread over her chest. Underneath the heavy fabric, her arms were strong from lifting 50-pound trash bags every night. Her hair was tied back in a neat, tight bun, keeping the stray curls out of her eyes. As she pushed her red plastic mop bucket toward Lecture Hall 304, she stopped. The heavy wooden door of the lecture hall was propped open with a brass doorstop. Inside, the massive three-tiered chalkboard was covered in white chalk dust. Elena walked inside and stood in front of the center board. Her eyes scanned the lines of equations. It was a complex topology problem regarding three-dimensional manifolds. She could see where the graduate students had hit a wall. They had spent hours trying to resolve a boundary crisis using standard algebraic geometry. They had failed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, frayed notebook. The pages were covered in her own tight, clean handwriting. She had spent the last 3 years studying her late father's advanced mathematics journals during her bus rides home to the South Side. Her father had been a high school geometry teacher, but his mind had belonged to the stars. When he died of pancreatic cancer, he left behind a mountain of medical debt and 3 boxes of dense, handwritten journals. Elena had to drop out of her sophomore year at Fulton to support her younger sister, but she never stopped reading. "What are you doing in here?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet lecture hall. Elena started, nearly dropping her mop handle. Professor Thaddeus Sterling stood in the doorway. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp tweed blazer and gold-rimmed spectacles. He held a leather briefcase under his arm. His expression was cold as he looked at her uniform, then at her mop. "I was just preparing to clean the board, Professor," Elena said quietly. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Then do your job and clean it," Sterling said, stepping into the room. He tossed a box of yellow chalk onto the main desk. "But do not touch that center board. That is graduate-level work for the doctoral seminar. It is far beyond your understanding." Elena looked at the board, then back at him. "The students are trying to resolve the boundary condition using algebraic topology, but the manifold is non-compact. They should be using geometric flows." Sterling paused. He stared at her, his brow furrowing. Then he let out a short, dry laugh. "Excuse me." Sterling walked closer, his leather-soled shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor. "You are a janitor, Brooks. You sweep the floors. You empty the trash. You do not offer mathematical critiques to doctoral candidates. Banish whatever foolish ideas you have. Banish them immediately." He picked up a piece of the yellow chalk. It was Hagoromo Full Touch chalk, the expensive, dense brand imported from Japan. "If you want to play with chalk, go back to elementary school," Sterling said. He turned to the sideboard and wrote a new equation. It was a vicious, multi-layered partial differential equation. "Solve this and I will hand you my tenure. Otherwise, Keep your hands off my chalkboards. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the lecture hall, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor. Elena stood alone, staring at the yellow writing on the board. The silence of the room settled back around her. The yellow chalk writing seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Elena looked down at her hands. They were rough, calloused from weeks of handling abrasive cleaning chemicals. She walked over to her red mop bucket. She stared at the water, watching the gray soap bubbles pop one by one. She thought about her sister's tuition bill sitting on their kitchen table. She thought about her father's voice, telling her that math was the only universal language that never lied. She walked back to the board. She reached out and picked up the piece of yellow Hagoromo chalk Sterling had left on the tray. The chalk felt heavy, smooth, and solid in her fingers. She did not use the standard methods Sterling taught in his lectures. She did not waste time with the long, tedious approximations that the doctoral students favored. Instead, she began to write. Her hand moved across the slate surface with a quiet, steady rhythm. The yellow chalk made a soft, crisp sound against the dark board. She treated the boundary problem as a fluid surface, letting the geometry flow naturally. She bypassed the algebraic bottleneck by projecting the manifold into a higher dimension, then collapsing the unused coordinates. She filled the entire sideboard in 20 minutes. The proof was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of mathematical simplicity, resolving a problem that had stumped the department for 6 months. When she was finished, she placed the yellow chalk back into the tray. She did not write her name. She picked up her mop, wheeled her red bucket out of the lecture hall, and finished her shift. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the hallway was bustling with students. Professor Sterling walked down the corridor holding a hot paper cup of coffee. He was flanked by two of his top PhD candidates, Toby and Marcus. The funding committee is looking for a breakthrough, Sterling was saying. If we cannot present a viable solution to the boundary problem by Friday, the $50 million research grant will go to Northwestern. They stepped into lecture hall 304. Sterling stopped. His coffee cup remained suspended in midair. Toby and Marcus pushed past him, their mouths dropping open as they stared at the sideboard. "My God!" Toby whispered. "Who wrote this?" Sterling did not answer. He set his coffee cup down on the desk, his hand trembling slightly. He walked slowly to the board, his eyes scanning the yellow equations. He checked the logic, searching for a flaw. There was none. The proof was flawless. "It is a completely new approach," Marcus said, leaning closer. "It bypasses the entire algebraic bottleneck." "Is this yours, Professor?" Sterling looked at the students, then back at the yellow chalk. He knew he had not written it. He knew none of his students could have written it. But the $50 million grant was on the line. "Of course," Sterling said, his voice tightening. "I came back to the lecture hall late last night. The inspiration hit me. I wrote it down before I could forget it." Toby stared at him with wide, reverent eyes. "This is genius, Professor. This will secure the funding." Sterling forced a smile, but his throat felt dry. He looked down at the chalk tray. A single piece of yellow Hagoromo chalk sat there, its tip worn down to a flat angle. By noon, the news of the Sterling proof had spread through the mathematics department like wildfire. Elena sat in the small, windowless break room in the basement of the building. She was eating a peanut butter sandwich she had packed from home. The door opened, and Arthur Pendleton, the head of campus facilities, walked in. He was a stout man with a stern face holding a clipboard. Behind him stood Professor Sterling. "Brooks," Pendleton said, "get up. We have an issue." Elena set her sandwich down. She wiped her hands on a paper towel and stood up. "What is the problem, Mr. Pendleton?" "Professor Sterling claims that someone entered Lecture Hall 304 last night and defaced his research boards," Pendleton said. "He wants to know who had access to the building." Elena looked at Sterling. The professor's face was mask-like, his eyes cold and unblinking. "I was the only one on the third floor last night, Mr. Pendleton," Elena said. "I cleaned the lecture halls." "Did you touch the chalkboards, Brooks?" Sterling asked. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but there was a hard edge underneath. "The university has strict policies regarding the preservation of academic materials. If a member of the custodial staff erased or altered my notes, it is a ground for immediate termination." "I did not erase your notes, Professor," Elena said. "I only wrote the solution to the equation you left for me." Pendleton frowned, looking from Elena to Sterling. "You wrote what?" Sterling let out a dry, dismissive chuckle. "Mr. Pendleton, this is absurd." The board was covered in highly advanced topological geometry. "Miss Brooks is suggesting she solved a problem that has stumped our doctoral department for months. She is clearly lying to cover up her vandalism." "I am not lying," Elena said, her voice rising slightly. "I use geometric flows to bypass the boundary bottleneck." "That is enough," Pendleton barked. "We are going to look at the security footage. If you were in that room doing anything other than cleaning, Brooks, you are done." They walked up to the security office on the first floor. The room was small and airless, filled with the hum of cooling fans and the blue glow of 12 monitor screens. The security guard, a young man named Dave, queued up the footage from the third-floor hallway. "Here we go," Dave said, pointing at the screen. On the black-and-white monitor, the clock read 2:14 a.m. The camera showed the empty hallway outside Lecture Hall 304. A figure wearing gray scrubs and carrying a mop walked into the frame. It was Elena. She entered the lecture hall. A few minutes later, Professor Sterling was seen walking out, his briefcase in hand. Then the camera showed the hallway remaining empty for 20 minutes. At 2:40 a.m., Elena walked out of the room, wheeling her red mop bucket. "See?" Sterling said, pointing a finger at the screen. "She was in the room alone. There was no one else. She defaced my board." "She was cleaning, Professor," Pendleton said, squinting at the screen. "For 20 minutes?" Sterling countered. "She had no business remaining in that room for 20 minutes. She has admitted to writing on the board. This is a clear violation of university policy. She must be fired immediately." Pendleton looked at Elena, his expression hardening. "Brooks, I can't keep you on the schedule if you are writing on the professor's boards. I'm going to have to suspend you pending a formal review." Elena felt a cold lump form in her throat. She looked at Sterling. He was looking back at her, his face devoid of any remorse. He had stolen her work, and now he was destroying her livelihood to protect his lie. The suspension was immediate. Elena spent the next 2 days in her small apartment, staring at her father's old notebooks. She could not sleep. Without her weekly paycheck, she would not be able to pay the electric bill, let alone her sister's tuition. On Friday morning, she received a text message from Toby, the doctoral student she had seen in the hallway. Elena, please come to the administration building. The funding committee is here. Professor Sterling is presenting the proof, but there is a major problem. We need you. Elena stared at the phone. She did not want to go back to the campus that had rejected her. But she thought of her father, and she thought of the yellow chalk proof that belonged to her. She put on her coat and walked out the door. The Fulton Administration Building was a grand neo-Gothic structure with marble floors and towering stained glass windows. The main boardroom on the second floor was packed with people. Members of the university board, the International Funding Committee, and representatives from the National Science Foundation sat around a massive mahogany table. At the front of the room stood Professor Sterling. He was standing next to a large digital display presenting the slides of the proof. By projecting the manifold into a five-dimensional space, Sterling said, his voice confident and booming, we can bypass the boundary crisis entirely. This proof guarantees the stability of our model. Sitting at the center of the mahogany table was Dr. Hans Becker, a world-renowned topologist from Zurich. He was a small man with sharp, dark eyes, wearing a dark gray suit. He had spent his entire life studying the boundary problems of three-dimensional manifolds. Becker was looking at the slides with his chin resting on his hand. He had not written a single note. "Professor Sterling," Becker said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room. "Your projection is elegant, but there is a severe mathematical crisis on slide 9. Sterling froze. The confidence in his eyes wavered for a split second. "Slide 9, Dr. Becker? That is the coordinate reduction phase." "Yes," Becker said, standing up. He walked to the digital board. "You have collapsed the fourth and fifth coordinates to return to three-dimensional space. But in doing so, you have assumed the manifold remains differentiable at the boundary." "It does not. Look at your seventh line." Sterling stared at the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Toby, who was sitting in the back row. Toby looked down at his lap, his face pale. "If the manifold is not differentiable," Becker continued, "the entire model collapses. The $50 million funding depends on a stable model, Professor. If this proof is unstable, we cannot award the grant." The members of the funding committee began to whisper among themselves. The university board members looked at each other in panic. Sterling's forehead was covered in a thin sheet of sweat. We can resolve the differentiability issue. It is just a minor technical adjustment." "It is not minor," Becker said coldly. "It is a foundational error. Unless you can show me the math that resolves this transition live. Right now, we are leaving." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the projector. Sterling held a dry erase marker in his hand, his fingers shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He stared at the board, completely helpless. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. No one moved. The quiet humming of the projector filled the space, its white light washing over Sterling's pale, sweating face. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the room creaked open. Elena Brooks walked in. She wore her faded winter coat over her blue jeans and a simple black sweater. She did not look at the board members or the wealthy donors. She walked straight down the center aisle toward the front of the room. "Who is this?" the university president, Arthur Vance, demanded, sitting up in his leather chair. "This is a private committee meeting. Security, please." "Wait," Toby said, standing up from his seat. "Mr. President, this is Elena Brooks. She is the one who wrote the proof on the board. A murmur of confusion ran through the crowd. Sterling's face went from pale to a dark, angry red. "This is ridiculous!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. "She is a suspended custodian. She is a vandal. She has no business being in this room." "Let her speak," Dr. Becker said, raising his hand. He looked at Elena, his sharp eyes examining her calm, determined expression. "Young lady, do you know how to resolve the differentiability crisis on slide 9? Elena walked to the front desk. She did not touch the dry erase marker. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single, pristine piece of yellow Hagoromo chalk she had kept from her cleaning kit. She walked past Sterling. She did not look at him. She stood in front of the green chalkboard that lined the side wall of the boardroom. "The differentiability does not fail," Elena said. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried a natural authority that silenced the murmuring board members. "The error is not in the math. The error is in how Professor Sterling translated my notes." She pressed the yellow chalk against the green slate. She wrote the coordinates again, but this time she did not use the standard algebraic reduction. She introduced a localized transition matrix, allowing the manifold to deform smoothly along the boundary. Her hand moved with incredible speed and precision. The yellow chalk clicked against the board in a rapid, rhythmic pattern. The math flowed across the board like water, beautiful, logical, and absolute. Dr. Hans Becker leaned forward, his eyes wide. He stood up from his chair, walking closer to the board as Elena wrote the final line of the proof. "She is using a nonlinear flow," Becker whispered, his voice filled with awe. "She is letting the boundary contract under its own curvature. It is brilliant!" Elena finished the final equation and took a step back. She placed the yellow chalk on the tray. "The manifold is stable," Elena said. "The differentiability is preserved." "Who are you?" "Professor Sterling," Becker said, his voice flat.